I wanted to get up to Penn State, and James Franklin and his entire staff here rolled out the red carpet for us. We've been up here for a couple of days, and we are, like I said, we're right outside his office right now. He is done eating dinner, though. They rolled out the red carpet. I sat down with Coach Franklin yesterday for about 30 minutes. He went really in depth, not just on his team, but he went really in depth on a lot of college football behind-the-scenes stuff that, honestly, it's hard to get head coaches to talk about on the record or off the record. And not only was he willing to talk about it, he was willing to go on the record and talk about it. So without further hesitation, here is our one-on-one sit-down with Penn State head coach James Franklin. The Pate State Speaker Series, Spring 2023. This is James Franklin. He's the head coach of Penn State. I wore a white T-shirt the last 3 years. The trade-off was you come on the show. I appreciate you being a man of your word. Are you ready to just predict a Big Ten championship right now?
No, but I will say this. Every time you say Pate State, it always kind of, is he plugging Penn State? Or no, we're excited about the season, obviously. We got some good things going. Obviously, whenever you end the season the way we did, with a really good win in the Rose Bowl against a team I got a ton of respect for, that Utah football team. I think they do it the right way. So that momentum has kind of led us into the off season. Got a good number of pieces coming back, and still got some kind of recruits that are still coming in the summer. So hopefully a couple of those guys will be able to help us. So there's a lot of excitement, but as you know, our side of the conference is challenging.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to be ready to go, starting with West Virginia in week 1.
How do you get, I mean, when you come out of a Rose Bowl season, it doesn't get much better than that, but it can get a little better than that. So when you self-evaluate, it's got to feel like inches instead of miles. How did you guys go about diagnosing the program, tweaks you wanted to make? How do you know when to have patience versus when to be aggressive and go after altering something about the program?
Yeah, I think in today's day and age, you better be aggressive, 24/7. And I think one of the things that we're going to be able to do now, after this Rose Bowl win, is take advantage of some momentum. One of the things I've been talking about really since coming to Penn State is alignment. And I think for the first time since I've been here, we have true alignment from the chair of the board to the university president and to the athletic director. And that's exciting for me, is because the reality is all those little yeses that you get in the offseason, they add up, just like all those little no's add up as well. And right now we're getting more yeses than I can ever remember. And probably to most people, I would tell you what the yeses were, and you wouldn't think much of it, but they add up.
You just talked about something that is the bane of some head coaches' existence right now, and that is the no's they get or the yeses they fail to get that the public doesn't really know about. They see the product on Saturday, and if it's not good enough, well, we want you to be better, but yet they don't know the mechanisms that go into Sunday through Friday making it happen. I remember a couple of years ago talking about Penn State, talking about in reference to how Penn State and James Franklin measure up to the Alabamas, to the Georgias, to the Ohio States. And at the time, I remember saying, well, do you know that he has everything those folks have? And it got a really interesting reaction from the Penn State fan base, because a lot of them said, you may be right about that. And now I sit here a couple of years later and hear you say, we get yeses more than we ever have before. I imagine there's a lot of fighting that has to go on behind the scenes to start to get the ball rolling as fast as it needs to uphill the way those other major programs have it.
Yeah, I think that's a critical point. And what I've tried to say really since coming to Penn State is if you can do a really good job with the other 364 days of year, the Saturdays should take care of themselves, those days. But that's easier said than done, and that's when I talk about the alignment. It takes buy-in. It's really hard to get inside the top 25 if you're not there. It's really hard once you get inside the top 25 to get inside the top 15. Once you get inside the top 15, it's really hard to get inside the top 10. But I would say that gap between outside the top 25 and in, or even from 25 to 15, the gap from the top 10 to those top 4, I think is a wider gap than any other area, probably 1 through 31. And that's where when you can get those little wins and you're fighting and scratching and clawing for that one more recruit or whatever it may be that's going to allow you to be more efficient and more successful, it's challenging, and we're doing a better job of that right now across the campus.
I'm not asking you to ever make someone feel sorry for yourself. I'm not asking you to complain. I'm just asking you point blank, how hard is the off-the-field job of a college football coach? At a place like Penn State, major college football, you're expected to compete at the national level. Do you feel like it's just always been hard, or are there unique challenges today that make it uniquely harder than it has been before?
Yeah, I think it's very different. I say to people all the time in today's college football, as an assistant or as a coordinator, you can make a really good living and still stay true to what you loved about the game. And that's coaching ball, and that's being with the players. And in this role, you're doing so many things other than football. At most places, there's a few places across the country where you don't have to be, but at most places, the head coach responsibility, you're taking on so many things other than scheme, fundamentals, and coaching. And I tell people all the time, you could make an argument right now if you're Manny Diaz, and you can just be a great coordinator and coach ball and be around the guys and leave all the drama to me. There's a lot of value in that. And I think if a lot of coaches maybe in my seat now, if they look back the way things have changed, you're responsible for these kids 24 hours a day, and that didn't used to be the case. I'm responsible for 125 18 to 22-year-old males, the most unpredictable group of people on the planet, and you're responsible for them 24 hours a day. And then again, at a lot of places, there's so many things that are outside of your control that really can impact the job you're doing and how you're able to compete on Saturdays. That's where it can be frustrating at times.
I've always pictured, if I was ever a head coach, I would say a prayer before I went to bed, and I would say another one when I woke up in the morning, just hoping nothing happened overnight. Because of the stuff that sometimes is out of your control, you can have the best culture in the world. You guys have a pretty darn good one here, but ultimately it's on decision-making, and it's on decision-making of guys that you hope you've put in the best position, but ultimately have to put themselves in the best position. I mean, is there ever just random nervousness when you wake up in the morning? Even though you may have confidence in guys, they're still human.
Yeah, I'm looking to knock on wood here, to be honest with you. I will say this. Being at a place like Penn State helps. Penn State attracts a certain type of kid from a certain type of family, and I think that helps. On top of that, I tell the coaches all the time, let's not get intoxicated by talent and talent alone. We should be recruiting the whole package here. So that helps. I mean, don't get me wrong. Got 125 guys on the roster. We got 5 knuckleheads, yeah. But our knuckleheads are different than maybe what some other people are dealing with. Not, again, knock on wood. But I'm proud of our guys, of how they go about their business in the classroom and in the community. But it's constant. I mean, you got to be talking about these things constantly with your guys, because at the end of the day, they're still kids. And I think that's where people get confused sometimes. They see them, and they're 6'5", 295 pounds. They look like grown men, but they're still just young kids that are still growing and developing.
Do you have time whatsoever to soak in the magnitude of your job? How few the positions are at your level, and the fact that you got one of the big ones?
Well, I think probably early on, obviously, when I left Vanderbilt and came to Penn State, which was hard to do, to be honest with you, that magnitude hit. I grew up just outside of Philadelphia. All the buddies I went to college, I went to a teacher's college here in the state of Pennsylvania, so all my buddies are high school coaches and teachers throughout the state. So the magnitude hit, because to be honest with you, I said in the press conference when I got the job, this was my dream job, but the reality is I didn't think it was necessarily attainable. Yeah. I thought it would stay kind of within the family. Someone that had coached at Penn State, or part of that tree. So I didn't think it was a realistic opportunity. And then when it happens and I'm being announced as the head coach, and I got my daughters, and at that time they're little teeny things, and my wife, and a bunch of my buddies came up for the press conference. So I think that moment, it kind of hit me. And then I think, there's certain times after the Big Ten championship in 2016, that was a moment where you took a deep breath and took it all in. And then that night at 2 o'clock in the morning, I'm fighting to keep my offensive coordinator, Joe Moorhead. So I mean, literally 2 o'clock in the morning, so it changes quick. And those moments are kind of fleeting. And the reality is just how competitive it is year round. If you're spending too much time smelling the roses and kind of taking it all in, then you're not progressing to build that next season and the next team.
It's interesting you talk about how at one point, for all of us, it seemed like that job, the head coach at Penn State, would kind of stay in a circle, and then all of a sudden you're the head coach at Penn State. Because in our world, in the media world, for a long time it felt that way. And then all of a sudden you get digital streaming, and it knocks like the Berlin walls of overhead and distribution. Now, so all of a sudden now anyone theoretically has a path in there. I'm interested because I feel this all the time. When you do break down one of those walls, or you end up being a guy that holds a position maybe people didn't think someone like you would hold, how either voluntary or involuntary do you find yourself to have inspired other people? How often do people tell you, hey, the way you've done things, your path, you may not know it, but it actually sparked me to do this or go this route? Do you ever hear that?
Yeah, I think so. Whether it's, a person of color in this position, that factors in. I think I hear that from a lot of young coaches. Whether it's someone who's got, a D2 background like I do, Division II. I mean, you look at my resume, it's frightening for some people. I know it scares a bunch of the coaches around the conference, around the country, when you see Kutztown and East Stroudsburg and then obviously James Madison and Washington State, and then kind of working my way up the ladder at some really cool places and for some really good people. But yeah, I think I kind of have an unusual path and an unusual story. So I'm proud of that. I'm proud of my roots and kind of where I've come from. I think it aligns a lot with Penn State because I think this is kind of a blue-collar program, so I think that helps. My values align with Penn State's values. So I think that's why it's made sense for the last 10 years and just signed another 10-year contract. So I'm excited about that.
You were talking about trying to keep Joe Moorhead at 2 a.m. right after winning a Big Ten championship. If there could ever be a reality show on any one behind-the-scenes aspect, other than maybe recruiting, I think just staff changes, staff hires, if the curtain could ever just be peeled back and people could see that process, how wild does that get relative to the perception people have? Because people already think it's wild, but there's no rest. Things have to change, spur of the moment, 20 times on you. How wild is it when you're trying to either keep a guy or you're going after a guy, and it's a really competitive market?
Yeah, I think it's really wild. I think people like yourself, kind of really understand what's going on behind the scenes. I think most people don't. It's interesting. Soon as I see that a guy that has a current job and the next job that's after him becomes public, it's almost impossible for that guy to get the job or take the job. That happened this year. I kind of watched it closely with a coach, and he kind of really had to come out at some point. It drug on, his name kind of get mentioned, and it kind of drug on to the point where the team finally is like, what's the deal? Are you in or you're not? And the fans get tired of it, and the media gets tired of it. And the problem is I think most guys are good guys and they want to do it the right way. But what people don't understand is sometimes you're put in a very difficult position, and you want to be honest. But the other thing is sometimes something changes. Yeah. You felt like during the negotiation you were going to get this, you didn't get it. And now that changes the lens on how you're looking at the job. And, I try to be as transparent as I possibly can, with the guys here, because the other reality is sometimes that conversation is going on to help the players and to help the program, because maybe this place is resistant to doing some things that they need to do to move the needle. And sometimes this helps.
I mean, it's not been all that long ago that the USC job's open. Your name's out there. Lincoln Riley ends up being the head coach. But I remember at the time thinking to myself, I don't really care how that turns out for him. It's going to be good, because you're either going to go somewhere where you wanted to go in that scenario, or you're going to get some checks and some boxes maybe that you needed. And I don't know if players are aware of that necessarily, or it's not even in their lane, but I remember watching that this last time around with you from afar, down in Nashville, just minding my own business and thinking, that's got to be going on behind the scenes. And you pretty much say, yeah, it was going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, I think what happens to a lot of times, and it obviously depends on the guy, and I know this is probably going to sound weird coming from where I'm sitting, but I think if you're trying to be the highest paid coach in college football or your own conference or those types of things, and that's what drives you, then yeah, that's going to be one of the boxes you check. But really, for me, it's always been, how can I put myself, my family, my team, my coaches in the best position to be successful. And I remember being at Vanderbilt with David Williams, who was the athletic director, who I got a ton of respect for. David was like a father in some ways professionally to me, and passed away a few years ago. But I remember working with David, and he was happy that this was happening, because things that he knew we needed, it allowed him to go to the board and have conversations. So it was kind of like we were working together with it. And I think, it's a compliment, right? I think it's a compliment to the current coach. It's a compliment to the program. Obviously, the program is healthy and thriving. So, hopefully you're in a position where you can have honest conversations with people and dialogue. But I do think during the season, more times than not, guys are focused on the job. Now, maybe their representatives are having conversations, but you are focused on the job. And I think more times than not, that's an honest answer.
I could talk to you all day about this because I got fascination about it. One more question about that. So the inner workings, especially during the season, you're completely locked in on the task at hand, but yet there is that outside world, which is why you have a representative, 99% of the time at least, you have a representative. How often are you and maybe an average coach in contact with your representative during the season? Is it a weekly thing? Is it a daily thing? Because I don't think hardly anyone in our audience would have insight into that world.
Yeah, I think it's like anything else, right? I think every situation is different, and I think some coaches and ADs have had enough and agents have had conversations in the off season. Hey, I do not want to have these conversations. You manage it, and if it's something where you can't manage it any longer and you got to come to me about something, then we'll do it. But I think more times than not, literally during the season, you're letting somebody handle that. Now, I think when you get into that bowl season and it's getting later in the year and decisions have to be made, then I think maybe a conversation, at least is had.
Yeah.
But I think more than not, like for myself, I want to be laser focused on the season, and I want somebody else handling those conversations. And hopefully those conversations are happening not only with the schools that are calling about you, but with the current administration from where you're at. Again, if it's a healthy situation.
There's a really interesting thing. Anytime I bring up Penn State on the show, it's understood the program's in a really good spot, but there's also this what I call a Saban warp that has been on the sport for about a decade and a half now, to where the perception of success has been totally skewed by a program winning half a dozen national championships, which is unrealistic compared to any other point in history. And I'm very curious if you've felt that, like inside the business of 4 11-win seasons, a Big Ten championship, Rose Bowl last year, in another era, maybe just in the early 2000s, that would be looked at as the pinnacle of Penn State football. And internally, it may be looked at that way, but nationally, people look and say, well, yeah, but you haven't done this. Do you ever feel that? You ever feel like the era you're competing in has been totally warped in terms of perception?
Yeah, and I think the point you brought up is a good one. I think that's part of kind of the BCS when that started, and now obviously the new system we're in. But I think that's been kind of the challenge, right? I mean, you're talking about New Year's bowl games, which used to be kind of what everybody worried about, and now it's kind of the playoffs or bust, especially if you're at a place that people would consider a top 15 job, a blue blood. Then I do think that's kind of the nature of it. That's kind of the nature of college football now. If you're at this type of program, it's competing for a national championship or nothing. And I think that is really challenging. To me, it's also interesting when you think about when we got this job and what the job was like and where the program was at the time, coming in at a very challenging time in Penn State's history. There was talk that the program wouldn't be back until now. People are saying it won't be back for 10 years. So I am proud of that. But I do have really high expectations and standards. So I embrace kind of, those discussions and those thoughts that people are talking about, nationally, but really, to be honest with you, regionally and specifically to the Penn State people. I understand clearly what the expectations and the standards are here, but I think your point is a good one and is a valid one. It's changed college football dramatically.
We're in what, for lack of a better term, is just considered the NIL era, transfer portal era. It's a fight that a lot of programs are having internally. Some are haves, some are have-nots. Some are haves that need to exhibit it a little bit more. What's the challenge been to maintain roster integrity while also scanning the landscape and seeing if there's a Penn State caliber player out there? It's 365 days a year, which recruiting always was, but now the process of talent acquisition has morphed so much. You probably have people employed in this building in roles that may not have existed even 5 years ago. Do you not?
Yeah, that's definitely fair. It's interesting. I'll kind of lead with this. The first thing I think is interesting, fascinating, frustrating, is the people that have always been giving money, they were way ahead, because all they did was take a way that was viewed as illegal under the old NCAA rules, and they just said, look, you have a culture of giving already, and we're just going to transfer it now.
A culture of giving is really kind. It's a really kind bow to put on it.
But my point is literally these people are used to giving to the players. Well, you're going to do it, and now you're just going to do it this way. So those programs were way ahead. I would also say programs like Penn State, historical programs, I think a lot of them have struggled. You've spent so much time educating your fan base and your donors on what you can do and can't do that it's hard. And I think most people start off, including myself, being uncomfortable with it, and then you have to change. And it's no different than any other industry, right? The rules change. You better change with them. You better embrace the new change. You better be bold and aggressive, or you're no longer going to be competitive and you're no longer going to exist. And that's any industry.
I assume you talk to several coaches behind the scenes. You got a network of friends just like I would in the media world. Forget about naming names, obviously, but off the record, when this thing first became what it is now, it seems like it sort of was ham-fistedly, Meemaw term, ham-fistedly just thrown down the pike, and you guys were told, figure it out. What were those conversations like?
Well, one of the things that probably frustrates me is people say, well, this has had unforeseen consequences. We didn't know. Yeah, everybody within the business knew exactly where this was going. I think at the end of the day, the NCAA was getting sued in every direction. They knew this was coming. That's really what we're going through now. We've kind of dug into the rule book the NCAA has and says, okay, what are the rules that we're most at risk for getting sued on? And let's try to get rid of those rules. And the rules that, let's be honest, are not enforceable anyway. They're in the rule book, but nobody can really enforce them. So I think that's what you see happening. I think at first there was frustration within the coaches. I think there's still to this day a fear and a reality of a lot of really good coaches in college football that are leaving to go to the NFL. I think that is a real thing. And I also think there's a sense now with coaches and athletic directors that we all recognize that some form of collective bargaining agreement or something is inevitable for the sport, that the players are going to get paid. And I think now people would rather that happen than what we're living in right now, because there's no guardrails. There's no guardrails for the recruits. There's no guardrails for the coaches and the administration. Everything's verbal deals. And I don't think it's in the game's best interest, and I don't think it's in the student-athlete's best interest. And again, I'm on the side that I think the players should be getting paid. So I don't want to be misinterpreted what I'm saying. I just think there's got to be some type of guardrails to protect the student-athletes. You saw examples of guys signing with a school or committing to a school because they thought they were going to get X. And the conversations that I've had is a lot of times those things aren't panning out the way they thought they would.
Well, I had a big fear when this first started out of the term Wild West that gets thrown around a lot, which was apropos, frankly, with the way that this started out. But the more people you talk to on the business side of NIL, and especially at the administrative level, the folks who have started to get their act together, the more I've talked to them, thankfully, I've gained a little confidence over probably the past 6 months that the direction you're talking about going, the collective bargaining, possible, dirty word here, employment status future of players, it's a terrifying concept for a lot of people. You just mentioned, though, the alternative is probably more terrifying. And, my mind is now we're probably gaining towards an eventual cruising altitude that, while it's radically different, the net result of it may not be all that dissimilar than what we had 10 years ago. The tier structure may be strikingly similar. It's just the net result is the players have deeper pockets in the process.
Yeah, and there was a bill in California. I think it was like 30% of the revenue and things like that. So I think that's what's going to happen. And I think, to be honest with you, most people, whether it's commissioners, ADs, head coaches, I think would embrace that and be comfortable with it. At least everybody kind of knows what you're dealing with.
You've got, by pretty much every preview magazine culture estimation, a really good team that you're about to field here. You got a really good group of players. I don't know if you would call it a team yet. That's what you're building right now in the middle of spring practice. Summer conditioning's coming up, and you'll have fall camp. I know that you guys had a really, really high-level class come in last cycle. You were in the process of putting together one right now, but I'm really interested when you talk about the amount of captains that walked out the door and finding the guys that are going to have that C on their chest in this unit, in the 2023 version of Penn State. It doesn't really matter how many stars were next to anyone's name. That's the sort of adhesive and gel between the blocks that end up determining whether you're going 9-3 or playing meaningful post-New Year's Day football. What actually goes into that? Because there's a part of it a coach doesn't even control, is there not? That's got to happen in the locker room.
Yeah. So that's probably our biggest challenge, and we spent a lot of time this offseason talking amongst the coaches about this, but also the players. From a leadership standpoint, last year the leadership was as good as we've ever had. Part of that was fifth-year guys that were returning captains. Some of those were six-year COVID guys. With Sean Clifford, it was his 12th year at Penn State, it felt like. So what I tried to explain to the coaches and tried to explain to the players is, in our minds, trying to replicate the leadership we had last year. It's not going to look like that. It's going to look different. It's going to sound different. It's going to feel different. That doesn't mean our leadership can't be just as strong or stronger this year, but it's going to be different. You're not going to have a Jair Brown-Tig, who is one of the more natural leaders that I've ever been around, or a P.J. Mustafer, or a Sean Clifford. So it's going to look different, and more people are probably going to have to take responsibility for that and spread it out. But that's probably our biggest challenge. We were an older team last year. We're going to be young and talented this year, and we're going to need some of these guys to step up at maybe an earlier stage of their careers.
I'm going to get you out of here on this. I always love to ask coaches this. What is something that you look back on in your first years as a head coach that you just can't believe? You say, I was so totally wrong on this. I have so evolved on this one thing or this one particular philosophy. Is there anything that immediately comes to mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if there's something that jumps out specifically like that. Like right away, my mind goes back to Vanderbilt, and I remember kind of sitting in that building. It's like you got all these plans as a head coach of what you're going to do, and then you get there, and you're sitting in the building by yourself, and you're trying to talk to you're trying to talk to the current staff of who you're going to retain. I remember calling Brent Pry, and he wanted like a farewell tour to say bye to everybody, and he's like, when do you need me there? I'm like, I need you here tomorrow, like tomorrow. And he's like, well, I can't be there tomorrow. And I was like, well, I need you here tomorrow. And he goes, hey, by the way, what am I going to make? And then I told him what he's going to make. And he goes, I'll be there tomorrow. But I just think about, I think one of the better things that I did taking the Vanderbilt job, and maybe the Vanderbilt job allowed me to do this, is I hired a bunch of people that wanted to be at Vanderbilt and wanted to be with me rather than going out and making the sexy hire. And I think that's one of the most valuable things I did. It was a core group of guys that were there with me, that wanted to be there with me, that weren't already looking for the next job. It wasn't a stepping stone job. And that core group of guys, we stayed together for a long time. I've kind of lost a few, every year over the last 10 years. But that's probably one of the better things that I did. But the things that kind of jump out in terms I was totally wrong on, I'm not sure. That doesn't kind of jump out in my mind.
It's probably
right
a good
away.
thing.
Well, no, because there's probably a ton of small things that I know I've learned and evolved from over the years. But I don't know if there was that one, dramatic thing that jumps out.
Well, look, this is a really good-looking jacket. First off, I think you may be well on your way to getting another good-looking one, maybe with a different logo on it this year. James Franklin, head coach, Penn State. We appreciate you joining us.
Thank you so much.
Well, first off, I need to mute my laptop. I cannot speak highly enough of the willingness to give access that really James Franklin and his entire program have had to us over the past 2 days. It is always really, really appreciated on our end when programs do that. We have programs reach out sometimes. We can't get to everyone. I'm going to hit up several between now and the time the fall season kicks off, and you'll see that in due time. But the willingness to be open, and also the appreciation on our end that there's the trust factor that you're willing to open the program. It is mutually beneficial, or at least we intend it to be. But I can safely tell you, Penn State has done it. Some of the other programs out there have done it. It's always appreciated on our end. We're happy to help in any way, but also we are immensely grateful that you help us.